Hello, this is a preview of the session Learning Design for Contextually Anchored Professional Development. It is an Inspire session, so in this video, I'll give you some background to the concepts and the main idea, and then in the session, we'll actually try out some of the activities and ideas that I did in a professional development workshop sessions for teachers. So my name's Melissa War. I'm a doctoral candidate at Arizona State University. Here's my information. You can find me here. So this session stems out of some work I did with 4 teachers in a small rural junior high school combination school. It started in January 2020 and continued through the summer, and we still are meeting a bit today. And it's the idea of using design to support professional learning that creates knowledge that is adapted to what teachers need in their context. And so it draws upon these ideas of creativity, design, professional knowledge, and then professional development through design. So I'm going to give a quick overview of these ideas. They're each little threads that are going to thread through the professional development I do. So creativity, making something original and effective in a context. So this comes from Ron Beghetto's definition of creativity, something determined to be both original and task appropriate is defined within a particular context. So usually when we think of creativity, we think of like Mozart or Einstein, right? Or maybe professional artists. We also think of like smaller creativity, like this is a Christmas letter that my brother's family wrote. They had the pets play the part of the people writing the Christmas letter. So that was pretty creative to me. Let's consider this. This is a different type of creativity.
More comments about the meeting? I'd really like to hear from as many people as possible. What comments you had and reactions you had to being in that meeting yesterday.
I don't have anything about the meeting yesterday, but I was just thinking about 6. I was thinking that it's an odd. It can be an odd number too, because there could be 2, 4, 6, and 2, 3 2s. Then it's 6, and 2 3s. It could be an odd and an even number. And both. 3 things to make it, and there could be 2 things to make it.
And the 2 things that you put.
So here we have Sean. He's a 3rd grader, and he's very anxious to share this idea. He says, I've been thinking about 6. So for a 3rd grader, this idea of breaking up a number into 2 groups of 3 or 3 groups of 2 is pretty original, at least to him. It's a new insight he's made. We can argue over the task appropriateness of it. It's a mathematical way of thinking. The definitions are used a little differently, which the teacher helps him develop. But what this shows is this idea of a mini C creativity. For this student, he's coming to understand the number 6 and even in odd numbers in a new way that is unique for him. Then when he shares it out with his class, it's what we call little c creativity. This Christmas letter would also be little c. Then Beghetto also talks about pro C and big C, which is like the imminent. But I'm most interested in here in this mini C, this personal meaning making, because it's based on an individual's originality and understanding. And we're going to look at how personal meaning making comes into play through design and with professional knowledge. But first, let's talk about what design is, creating in the particular. Connected to creativity, Gryffindor said design is making sense of things, like it's a sense-creating activity, which puts it very closely with mini-C creativity. David Perkins said that design is a structure adapted to a purpose. So if you think about these doorknobs, they're each adapted to some particular purpose or need. They function slightly different. They all open doors, but the materials are different. The look is different. One of them doesn't have a lock on it because it probably is on a door that doesn't need to be locked. The other ones do. They all are created for a specific purpose. They're adapted to the particular, which that word particular, Nilsson and Stolderman talked about a lot. They contrasted the universal and true, where you have an only truth. So the principle of rotation or physics. its own self, its own truth. A lot of time in learning and teaching, we think about learning theories as an ultimate truth, universal and true. But there's also the ultimate particular and real, which is one of many possibilities. We could have many styles of doorknobs that would probably work, but this is the one that was adapted to this specific purpose. What's significant here to me is this idea of the real. The real is where teachers work. They don't work in the universal and true world. They work in the real world, which is very complex. And the ultimate particular lives in this complexity. So design is about creating in the ultimate particular. On we go to professional knowledge, which is meaning created for the particular. So we might think of professional knowledge as knowledge for the profession, but I like to take it deeper and think of it as professional knowledge for the particular professional. It's for this teacher in this classroom, this place, at this time. It is something molded to the purpose. So David Perkins was the guy who did that definition that said a design is a structure adapted to a purpose. And he said that in a book called Knowledge as Design, where he said knowledge is not just like design, but it is design in a quite straightforward and practical sense. It is something that is adapted to a purpose. It's what we know in order to do something. It's knowledge for something. So if we were to say professional knowledge is a design, it's adapted so that the teacher can work in their particular classroom, the question comes, how do we design professional knowledge? How do we support teachers in developing this type of knowledge? A lot of the time we give lectures and we talk about theories and principles, but that doesn't necessarily work or very closely apply to the real complex world they're living in. So a lot of people have suggested that perhaps we need to draw on this idea of design to create that type of knowledge. And I add to that this idea of creativity too, because it's about meaning making. It's about pulling in new ideas, thinking differently to design in a particular context. So the question comes, what are we designing? We can design like a product or solution. So this is like a bulletin board. There's also an idea behind this bulletin board of a literacy cafe menu. So there's tangible things, there's lesson plans, processes, all that stuff. But we are also designing professional knowledge. We're designing it particular to this purpose. So we're going to take a time out here and think back in time. This was September 27th, 2019. Seems like ages and ages ago. On my blog talkingaboutdesign.com that I do with some friends, I wrote this. I can design a professional development program for a particular group of teachers in a particular place and at a particular time. This is the design PD model I was developing when I wrote that. I was thinking about how could I develop something for these teachers in this rural school, using the different ideas that I have to experiment with as a research project at the same time as helping them. And so I created some principles that I thought might be universal and true, but they're also going to found the foundation of this model I was developing. And it was based on design, that when we design, we do or make something, and then we learn from what we did or made. And that learning is when we make sense of something. And doing and making is like representing and then making sense of it. So making or representing and reflect. And so in this workshop, I focused a lot on how to help teachers reflect in different ways, how to help them represent their knowing. And then I also wanted to expand the way we were thinking about things, because sometimes we get stuck in just analytical thinking all the time. And so we were emphasizing empathetic, analytic, creative, and aesthetic as ways of making and reflecting. I'll show you more about that later. So I started this with these teachers, 4 teachers, in January 2020. And we started by just exploring like a problem or a wondering of their context. And they created these postcards, which were a combination of words and images. We even did movements with them to explore a problem. And they each had individual problems, but we also talked about a general idea of trying to help the students in their school respect adults better and behave better. That was what these teachers were really struggling with. We talked about potential solutions that we could maybe start playing with to do it. And we talked about more about what we were trying to do. Like we were trying to get students to buy into school, buy into learning. What are we doing? What does that look like? And eventually they had students write letters, and we looked through the letters to try to understand the student perspective. The idea was we were going to take these letters and we were going to figure out something to do with them. But then March 2020 happened and school shut down. Flipping back again to September 2019, I also wrote this in my blog post. I have to recognize that these particularities will change even while I am designing. I don't think I fully comprehended at the time how significant that would be in my work. Because I focused on this design approach, where I was going to be flexible and work with what happened in the context, I think what resulted actually did end up being useful for teachers. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But what's significant here is that because of this design approach, where I was basing my work in the particularities, we were able to continue working even though the original idea didn't play out exactly as was planned. So we took a couple weeks off, and then we started again in early April. We started by building back on these ideas of engagement and learning, understanding students, and buy-in. We explored it in different ways. We talked a lot about how teachers and students were isolated at home. This ended up being a time they could express how they were feeling about things, which ended up being pretty significant. In some of our work, when we talk about analytical work, we partly go and look at research and what others have talked about and done about an idea. And they came across this idea of relatedness. Relatedness is connecting learning to other people and to the world. And so they thought about experiences in their life when they've been felt related, and they dug into what that feels like. They talked about what learning is. And then this combination of what learning is and relatedness, one of the teachers described being at school during 9/11 and how she learned during that time period through a project her teachers had given her to journal about her experience in 9/11, and that helped her make sense of her world at the same time. And so the teachers found online this COVID-19 packet. It's actually about 15 pages. And they used that to help the students process the time they're in. So this was an interesting period of time. We had a lot of very interesting conversations. It was also a very tense time, a very anxious time. And we wanted to keep working together because although they did do this COVID time capsule thing, it was mostly just finding something online that fit their purpose, but they didn't have time to modify it. And I wanted to dig a little deeper with them. And so we continued into summer. So at the beginning of the summer, we talked to the principal about some of the concerns for the school. And one of the major concerns was that the students were isolated and there were a lot of social emotional problems happening. So we decided to focus on building relatedness because we thought that could help both with the motivation for school and the engagement in learning, as well as some of these emotional mental health problems that are particular to this time when people are physically separated. So we did things like created mind maps and then talked about them. And our discussion about a mind map led into talking about zone of proximal development and how that could work in this situation. We read different literature. One of the teachers wrote a poem about what it felt like to be related, drawing on that aesthetic way of learning and knowing. They interviewed students. They called students to try to understand what the isolation was like to them and who they connected with and what might help them connect more. And they focused especially on this idea that it's important that students know that they are being heard and that is very meaningful to them. Then we took a whole bunch of ideas we talked about and we put them on a Padlet. This is just the top part of this Padlet. And we grouped them under ideas to try to have a little metacognition about how these different mindsets work together. But we moved these around and we grouped them in different ways and thought about how could we take some of these ideas and move it forward into an activity for students. And so we did a couple different activities. One was a flip grid, where we talked about, how could we create a flip grid that shows students that the other students hear them. There was some work on poverty mindset and gratitude, some journaling, connecting pie charts and different graphs to the world about it. This pie chart, use it in a way that relates to quarantine. So these were just small products that came out of the session. We didn't end up with a big capstone product, but I felt like that was okay because I think that what we did was still useful for them in developing particularly their professional knowledge. In the end, I was curious about what was useful, and because they kept telling me it was useful, I wasn't sure why. So we had a discussion about that. And this is what they told me. The math teacher talked about sketching, fail-free sketching, excavating relatedness. And then I asked him, has this changed who you are as a teacher? And he said, I have a different approach to authority as the teacher now. Another teacher, she talked about approach to questioning. That's the reflection skills I use. And she said she's using that in her classroom this year. She also talked about taking students' feelings into consideration. Might seem obvious, but she saw it in a different way. Another teacher focused on social emotional learning, building student-teacher relationships, and then was appreciative of the technology since we were doing all this online. And an English teacher similar had the technology, but also talked about looking at things from different angles and expanding self-awareness and knowledge. So what's significant to me here is that these are 4 very different teachers. We did the same things together, but they got out of it what was needed for them. They were able to develop some knowing and some knowledge that was unique to what they needed in their particular context. So if you want to learn more about this and maybe even try out some of the activities, come to the Inspire session. We'll talk about the online tools. We'll try out some of the ways of working I did with these teachers, and I'll give you some materials to move forward. I hope to see you there.